Hi, I'm Jacqui Newling. Thanks for joining me here at the Vaucluse House kitchen. This kitchen dates back to the 1820s, 1830s, when the house belonged to the Wentworth family, who were a very significant family in New South Wales at the time. We're celebrating spring, and this is when the pineapples come through. Now, at the moment, pineapples are flooding our shops. Sometimes they're only $1 or $2 each. But when the Wentworths lived here in the 19th century, they were regarded a really, really special and exotic fruit. So people wanted to capture the flavour of this fruit throughout the year. They could eat them when they were in season, but the only way to enjoy them at other times was to preserve them. There are many ways to pickle and preserve things, but for this particular pineapple recipe, I'm going to use vinegar, which was a very common preserving solution in the 19th century. To balance out the flavours, we're also going to add some spices. Now, pineapples mainly came into Britain from Jamaica. Jamaica was, at the time, a British colony, just like Australia was at the time. So we know that people loved their Indian curry flavours that connected them with the Indian part of the empire, the eastern part of the empire. Jamaica was from the West Indies. So Australia was actually quite globally connected through its food. So the spices we're using today are typical of a 19th century spice palette where you have spices from all over the globe. We have mace and nutmeg from Indonesia and the Spice Islands. We have cloves also from there. We have ginger from Jamaica or India. We have allspice, which used to be called Jamaica pepper because it comes from Jamaica. Cinnamon from Sri Lanka and India, and of course black gold, black peppercorns. So these were very commonly used in kitchens like this. To make our pickled pineapple today, obviously, we need a pineapple. And the reason they're called a pineapple is they look like a pine cone. They reminded Europeans when they first came across them in South America of the cone of the pine tree. And apple, pomme de terre, Eve's apple. Even tomatoes were called love apples at one point. So really, apple was a sort of generic name for fruit. So to pickle our pineapple today, we don't need too many ingredients. As I said, we've got vinegar, 2 cups of apple cider vinegar, which I'm going to tip in here. You can use any sort of vinegar, but I really like the colour of the apple cider vinegar. 1 cup of water. Just turn the heat on there. Then we're going to put in 1/2 cup of sugar, or you can do this to taste. Now, a lot of pickling recipes from the 19th century have no sugar in them at all. They're really very piquant. But our tastes are actually quite sweetened these days, so you may want to play with the sugar content when you're doing it. The sugar also does add a little bit of extra preservative for it, and of course so does salt. So we've got 2 teaspoons of salt, and then our spices. So, as I said, Jamaica pepper, allspice. It's a key flavouring in tomato sauce. So before you throw it into the pot, have a smell and just think about that sort of, your classic Australian tomato sauce. You'll capture it. We have a teaspoon of cloves, again, quintessentially 19th century. And of course, the king of spices, black pepper. Now, we're also going to use ginger. In the 19th century, ginger was imported. It came in powdered form, but also in these little sort of dried flakes. But in Australia today, it seems crazy to use dried ginger because we've got so much wonderful fresh ginger. So I'm just going to cut a few slices of ginger here. And again, we've written a recipe, but you can play with the flavours and quantities as you please, to your own taste. Now, we need this to come to the boil and simmer just for a few minutes, and then set it aside to let those wonderful spice flavours infuse. So 2 or 3 hours, or preferably overnight. So next day, once your vinegar solution's had time to steep, we're going to put it back on the stove, bring it back up to the boil, and now's the time to cut up our pineapple. So cut them into, depending on the size of your pineapple, cut them into little wedges, sort of bite-sized wedges that you're happy with. Now, to bottle them. You need a sterilised jar, and we've got instructions on how to sterilise jam jars and preserving jars on our blog, The Cook and the Curator. But essentially you're going to have a very clean jar, wash it in very hot water, hot soapy water, give it a rinse, pop it in the oven on 120 degrees Celsius for sort of at least 20 minutes or so. Take them out while they're still warm. Obviously mine have cooled, but be very careful getting them out of the oven. So we're going to fill the jar now with our pineapple pieces. You don't want to sort of pack them down, but you do want to, crowd the jar, fill the jar basically. The idea is to preserve as much fruit as we can. Okay, so we've got our jar of pineapple pieces. I've got the vinegar solution that we would have prepared the day earlier. It's had plenty of time to steep, and I've brought it back up to the boil. Now I just want to put a few of the spices, before we fill the jar, into the preserve, just really for aesthetics. I've also made batches of this with chilies as well. You could put dried chilies into the vinegar solution, or if you wanted a more oriental flavour rather than Jamaican, you could put Chinese star anise. It's really up to you, but the principle is the same. The idea is then to just fill the jar with the liquid. It's just make sure we cover the surface of the pineapple with the solution. That will ensure that it cures and stays pickled, immersed, until you're ready to eat it. Pop our lid on. Make sure it seals properly. And then we want to set that aside in a cool, dark place, so in your pantry or in a cupboard, for about 2 weeks. And the lid will suck down as the liquid cools and create a vacuum seal. That's how we stop air getting into the pickle and letting it oxidise. After the 2 weeks, it's ready to use. Once it's been opened, you could store it in the fridge, for another perhaps 3 months, if it lasts that long. It's delicious with curry. It's lovely with roasted pork or ham or a pork slider, if you want to be really modern about it. I wonder what the Wentworths would have thought about a pork slider. So there you have a jar of pickled pineapple. Pretty simple, hey? And it just means that once the pineapples are out of season, you can still enjoy the flavours of an exotic Jamaican pineapple.